think it was Richard, was it, who said that what we're going to look at, perhaps this morning, today, is the current situation. And I want to start with a slightly, I was going to say left field, but it's more like right field story, a cautionary tale that I want to tell you. It's a tale that reached its climax only a couple of weeks ago. But it's a tale whose climax, for a brief moment at any rate, tipped the whole world of economic policy on its axis, just for a moment. The ground moved. The story stars, if that's the right word, because there are no heroes in a sense, stars two Harvard economists. Some of you will know the names, Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff. If you haven't heard of them, let me assure you that they've been regarded for a long time as being at the very top of the tree. Just about the most authoritative economists you could turn to, and they have been turned to, because they have peddled a doctrine that has been very congenial to right-wing political leaders right across the Western world. And that influence reached its peak when they published in 2010 a paper called Growth in a Time of Debt. And the reason this appealed to right-wing political leaders so much was that it purported to show, after they'd done a survey of a very large number of countries over as long a period as they could find, for as long as the statistics allowed them to do that. And what they came up with was a conclusive position. If you're a country that allows your debt to exceed 90% of your national output in a year, then you've had it. Your growth will not only stop, it got every chance of turning down. So if you want to get out of recession, however counterintuitive it may seem, the first and most immediate thing you must do is cut your debt. Now this flew very much in the face of everything we'd learnt about the Great Depression. That's exactly what people said during the Great Depression. But we now know, largely thanks to the greatest economist of the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes, we know that that isn't the case. That isn't what you do. A recession is by definition an economy that is collapsing, going backwards. You don't solve that by slamming on the brakes. But it was a very congenial message, as I say, to those who saw the global financial crisis not as a pretty conclusive and damning verdict on irresponsible and greedy markets. No, they said somehow or another it's because government was too big. That's the message that they wanted to hear. And Reinhart and Rogoff gave them that message. So as a result, they were quoted everywhere. Paul Ryan, some of you will know the name as the Republican vice presidential candidate in the recent elections in America. He loved them. And he and his colleagues in the Tea Party and elsewhere, they ensured that President Obama's attempts to re-stimulate the economy couldn't work. They put roadblocks in position to stop it. And when they were challenged, they said, Reinhart and Rogoff told us in terms, and indeed they had, they'd been before the House Budget Committee and they'd said, the sooner the better, there's not a moment to lose. You must start cutting now. That's why there are still 7% or more unemployed in America. Many, many people worse off now than they've been in their whole lives. It wasn't just America. There's a guy called Olli Rehn, R-E-H-N. I don't know whether that's exactly how you pronounce it. Olli Rehn is the European Union's economic supremo. He loves Reinhart and Rogoff. He, with the Chancellor Merkel from Germany pushing him from behind, he's ensured that the Eurozone is not just sinking more and more into recession, they're nosediving further into recession. Millions of people out of work, literally millions. In some countries, as many as 25 or 30% unemployed. Whole economies, Greece, Spain, perhaps Italy, Portugal to come, are being destroyed. Not only destroyed, but with no prospect of recovery. Because what they're being offered is loans, which they have to repay, on condition that they destroy their economies. How it's ever expected that they could repay those loans, I do not know. But Ollie Rehn, he loves Reinhart and Rogoff. If he's challenged, he says these are the best economists around. This is what they're telling us, very clear. If you allow that debt to get to 90%, you've got to do something about it. I should just say in passing, our debt is at about 90%. George Osborne. I spent quite a lot of time in British politics. George Osborne has appeared on the scene since I left. But he too, he cites Kenneth Rogoff in particular all the time. He's presided over a British economy that has only just in the last few weeks avoided a triple dip recession. He's lost the one thing that he said was his goal, the top credit rating. That's gone. But he still says Reinhart and Rogoff know what's required. Now it's at this point that the story takes a somewhat unexpected turn. Because it so happens that at the University of Massachusetts in the US, in the economics faculty, the practice is, apparently, that graduate economics students, as an exercise, are asked to replicate the research undertaken by famous economists. And a young man called Thomas Herndon steps forward at this point because he was asked to replicate the research conducted by Reinhart and Rogoff. So he set about it. He found it very difficult. In fact, more than difficult, he was really puzzled. However much he tried to use the data available to Reinhart and Rogoff, and on which they based their conclusion, however much he tried, he couldn't get the same results. Nothing like it. Where did this 90% tipping point come from? He then took that problem to his supervisors, and the three of them eventually published a paper about a month ago, a little less than a month, which showed that Reinhart and Rogoff's seminal work, on which so much had been based, was totally vitiated by schoolboy errors. The first mistake was that they'd simply, because they didn't know how to handle an Excel spreadsheet, they just omitted some of the relevant data. It just slipped away. The second mistake they made, interestingly, involves New Zealand. You say, what? How did we get into this picture? One of the statistics they came across as they surveyed all these countries was a figure for 1951. At that time, the New Zealand economy was doing pretty well. The Korean War had pushed up wool prices and all the rest of it. But in 1951, our growth suddenly nosedived. They took this instance and gave it huge weight. Here was this tiny economy, which had been doing pretty well, suddenly diving. And they said, this is so significant because there they are at 90% debt in relation to GDP. And so suddenly little New Zealand became the basis on which this whole theory had been built. Almost any researcher will say you can't build a theory on just one odd example out of thousands. And of course what Reinhart and Rogoff had failed to notice was that 1951 was the year of an 8-month-long waterfront strike. That's what explained it. The third mistake they made, this is getting slightly more technical, is that instead of just running a series from go to woe, they organized the results of their research into bands, so that 90%, if you were below 90%, you fell into one band. If you got to 90% or more, you were suddenly in a much higher band of debt. So 90% could take you on to countries with 150, 200% debt. But the way they organized it, it made it look as though it was the 90% that was the critical point. It was just a method of marshalling the facts. It meant nothing. And in fact, if you strip that out, there was a continuum, perfectly normal one. But these three mistakes meant that the figures could not in any sense be relied on. But even if they had been reliable, Reinhart and Rogoff had never really considered the possibility that if there really was a link between high debt and low growth, the causal connection could well have been the reverse, and probably was or would be the reverse of what they said. It wasn't high debt that caused slow growth, much more likely that slow growth caused high debt. Now, you may say, oh, well, yes, okay, well, that's just one bit of research that's now been knocked out of the picture. Let me assure you, it was really all that was left. Because we're in course of proving all over again by our actual current experience that austerity and cutting, and particularly cutting government debt, isn't the solution to recession. In fact, it makes it worse. And there are all sorts of technical arguments that if you're in a situation where you've got a trade deficit and a private sector deficit, it's absolutely inevitable that you'll have a government deficit, that accounting identities. But none of this, let me assure you, will deter the Paul Ryans or the Ollie Raynes or the George Osbornes or even the John Keys. What, you say? Where did John Key come from in all of this? Well, John Key may perhaps never have heard of Reinhart and Rogoff. I don't know whether he has or not. He probably has by now. But although John Key is always portrayed as somebody who knows about the economy, after all, he made his fortune, didn't he, as a foreign exchange trader? But the reality is that if you are engaged in an undertaking, an activity, it's simply gouging existing assets from other people and putting it in your own pocket, you're not doing much for the economy. And you're doing so by using a time horizon that may be a day or two, more likely to be an hour or two, sometimes even minutes. Not quite the perspective that you need if you're going to run a whole economy. But never fear, John Key stands shoulder to shoulder with Paul Ryan and Ollie Rayne and George Osborne, and if he only knew it, Reinhart and Rogoff as well. Because we know that. Because John Key, when he took office in 2008, made it quite clear what his priority was. Still his priority. We're told it all the time. His priority is to cut the government's deficit. Nothing else matters. Unemployment at very, very high levels historically? No, it doesn't really matter. Running into trade deficits all over again, housing bubble in Auckland, all the familiar problems? No. The only thing that matters is cutting that deficit. And that's remarkable in a way, because of all the countries in the world, virtually, perhaps with the exception of Australia, we were better placed than anybody else to survive with reasonable comfort the global financial crisis. It hardly touched us. I know that's not the way it seems to us, not the way it's portrayed. But our Australian-owned banks, apart from ripping us off and taking off $3 or $4 billion in profits every year across the foreign exchanges, nevertheless, the one thing you have to say for them is that they maintained a pretty stable banking system. We weren't affected in that sense by the global financial crisis. I'm not saying that we didn't have to keep a pretty wary eye open for what was going on, but we ourselves weren't affected. In fact, our export markets which are now increasingly China and Australia, they too were pretty buoyant. The biggest buoyant economies in the world. We're lucky they were our markets. Not surprising. Our commodity prices have gone up. So what are we doing slamming on the brakes? By cuts in public spending, and in particular in public services. The reason is that John Key believes in small government. He can't conceive that a government doing its job properly can be helpful. He was brought up in that neoliberal era where such growth as the global economy managed to achieve, and it did, there was some growth all right, but virtually the whole of that growth went to the already very rich. Ordinary people in New Zealand as well as elsewhere across the globe over the last 30 years have struggled to maintain their living standards. In many cases, particularly at the lower end of the scale, they've gone backwards. Those that have managed to keep their heads above water have done so very often by working longer hours and by having more than one wage earner in the family. That's the reality of what's happened. But John Key, I think, sees it differently. What I want to demonstrate to you is that he has a very myopic, a very one-sided view of the economy. He believes that an economy can only work if you get government out of the way, because he doesn't think governments do any good here, and then you give the rich the freedom to do what they like. Now that's dressed up in saying we believe in a free market. But a free market that incidentally led straight to the global financial crisis, a free market is just a recipe for allowing the already powerful to entrench and increase their power at the expense of everybody else. So although John Key's first decision was to cut the government deficit, his second decision was equally significant. What he did second, which ran a bit counter to his first goal, was to give tax cuts to the well-off. We're still paying for those tax cuts. We paid for them initially because GST was put up, as you may recall. GST is an indirect tax that hits the poor, the less well-off, most severely, because virtually all of their economy, of their budgets, goes on areas that are GST liable. So that in itself was a mechanism for relieving the tax burden on the rich and piling it on to the less well-off. And it didn't stop there, of course. We've seen many other instances of that bias. We see it all the time. I've started actually, because every morning I listen to a morning report on national radio or whatever it is, and I think, my God, they can't get away with that. And then, of course, a month later, I can't remember exactly what that was. So I've taken to writing it all down. It's amazing. Every day, every week, there are new instances of how this government is favouring the rich at the expense of the poor. Just a little thing. I mean, first of all, perhaps a rather big thing. They won't hear a word said about a capital gains tax. So all those speculative profits that don't add anything to the economy, they're simply a transfer from one set of pockets to another. All those profits that are made for speculative purposes that do nothing to increase the national wealth or the public good, they go untaxed. Then we have the asset sales. Asset sales make absolutely no sense. I know there's a controversy about whether there are enough signatures. I only hope to hell that there will be. But just bear this little thought in mind. The government is able to borrow at present, and has been able to borrow for some time now, at about 3.5% interest. Rather than do that, it is selling assets that on average make over a 7% return. The only effect of what the government is doing is to get some spending off their own books, but to ensure that future taxpayers will have to pay the burden. It makes absolutely no sense at all. But it has one big advantage from the viewpoint of the current government. It provides renewed opportunities for a relatively small minority to play around with a fresh chunk of our assets. Just imagine the money that's currently being made by the stockbrokers and the advertisers and the investors. If things should go wrong, then it will be the accountants and the receivers who will make the money. But one way or another, privatizing these assets is a bonanza, a free-for-all for the private sector. And once again, these are not new items of wealth that are being created. They're being filched out of the pockets of those who can't take advantage of these supposed opportunities. Look at the housing bubble rapidly developing in Auckland. If you're fortunate enough, and you can't blame individuals for this is a social or economic phenomenon across the board. But if you own a house in Auckland, you can sit still and you'll make $100,000 a year untaxed. Just in capital gains. Where does that money come from? Not a single brick has been added to the national wealth. It comes from the pockets of those who are struggling to pay their rent or to find a home at all. What about little subsidies here and there? It's clear that, as we've seen in the last 2 weeks, there's not enough money for the Salvation Army to carry out its social work, but there is enough to pay, I think I'm right in saying, about 40 or 45 million in increased subsidies to private fee-paying schools. That's the truth of the matter. And in John Key's economy, it's quite clear that the only people he has any regard for are the big battalions. If they come from overseas, so much the better. Warner Brothers, Sky City, Newmont Gold, Petrobras, fine. Open the door and usher them in. The problem is that when we look to other parts of the economy, quite different view is taken. If you look to the interests of working people, you find a whole range of policies that haven't just arisen by accident, that are connected just coincidentally. They are part of a strategy. And that strategy requires that the rights of workers at work should be reduced by legislation. The power of trade unions to represent them, to undertake collective bargaining, that's being whittled away. It's also clear that people shouldn't be allowed to live on benefits, even if there are no jobs. They've got to be forced back into a labour market so that they can compete with those who are currently holding the lowest paid jobs. So benefits are cut, the conditions for achieving them are tightened up, there'll be drug tests, solo mums with young kids forced back into that labour market where there are no jobs. But they might just be prepared to take on a job at a lower rate than the guys who've got it now. The minimum wage, not keeping pace in real terms. Let's introduce a youth wage so that you take the floor away from the wages structure. If you can reduce it at the bottom, the whole lot sinks. Forget Australia and catching up. The real truth of the matter was inadvertently revealed by Bill English when he said, we've got a big advantage now over Australia, our wages are so low. That's the truth of the matter. And the whole strategy is designed to force down wages. And the reason for that is that working people and the contribution they can make are not rated at all. They have very little value. They are labour costs. And labour costs must be held down. It's a wonderful thing, the global economy, you know. The global economy tells us that if you're a top earner, you're entitled to that because the global economy sets the level. And if you want the best talent, then you pay the top whack. Great. But that same global economy, we're told, says if you're a working person, your wage has to be measured against the lowest labor costs we can find anywhere in the globe. So the global economy has this wonderful effect, so far as John Key and his government are concerned, pushing up salaries at the top and all the other advantages and depressing wages at the other end. Now, this all reminds me, I sometimes do a little bit of reading about economic history. Amazingly, you may think, when the Great Depression struck in the US, the then US Treasury Secretary was a man called Andrew Mellon. He was a millionaire. And what he did, while ordinary people were being thrown out of their jobs, and the Depression was taking hold, he made a speech in which he urged employers, and I'm not paraphrasing, I'm quoting him, he urged employers to liquidate labor. Recession, depression, have always been seen in some quarters, particularly in those quarters who are relatively untouched, they can survive it. But it's always been seen in those quarters as an opportunity to do down working people. Now, I don't think John Key would be caught dead saying that, although he's caught dead saying quite a few stupid things. But he prefers to smile and shrug it off if he did say anything of that kind. But he does say some very odd things. And I want just to, getting close to my finishing time, I just want to draw to your attention something that always surprises me didn't attract any attention. On the 13th of February of last year, John Key in his weekly stint on breakfast television, some of you may be foolish enough to watch that, I can't bear to watch it myself, but I did pick up that he was being quizzed, I think, about the capital gains tax proposal. What he said, and again I'm not paraphrasing, I'm quoting, he said, any new tax sucks money out of the economy. There's only a limited amount of money in the economy, he said. If you impose a new tax, or you tax people more, that sucks that money out of the economy. Now, no half-competent economist would ever agree with that. For a start, the amount of money in the economy is entirely dictated as to well over 95% by our commercial banks. They create most of the money in our economy by lending on credit, usually lending on mortgage. They do so without any constraint whatsoever other than their own profitability. So to say that there's only a limited amount of money in the economy is just plain daft. But what does he mean when he says taxes, and therefore what the taxes are applied to, sucks money out of the economy? Where does he think it goes? Into the stratosphere? Does he mean that all that taxpayers' revenue that we spend even on basic services like the defense forces and the police and the justice system, to say nothing of major services like health and education, does all of that count for nothing? Is it of no value to the economy? In his mind, is there sunlit uplands with beautiful crops and bushes and trees? That's the private sector, and there's a barren desert somewhere called the public sector. I think that's what he thinks and sees. And that explains a lot, I think, about where we've got to in this economy. And it explains a lot about the issues that are of importance to you, but they're also of importance to all of us. Because not only do government cuts, not only are they inappropriate in our current economic situation, because there's no stimulus coming from anywhere else, but they add directly to the unemployment totals, and they also reduce the efficiency and effectiveness of the public services on which a properly performing economy truly depends. It's easy to cut in the public services. It's only very occasionally that you get a cave creek or a pike river or something that says, hang on a minute, you've run that service down to such a degree that something really serious has gone on. Most of the time, it's just a war of attrition, bit by bit. I thought when I first came back to New Zealand, after a long stint in Britain, I was pretty worried, even in 1994, at what I thought was a very thin public service, particularly here in Wellington. It's got a lot worse since then, and particularly under this government. So we are really taking terrible risks with our government as we pursue the policies of this government. We're in danger of just reproducing, only more seriously yet again, the same old running on a treadmill. The Auckland housing bubble choked off by high interest rates leading to an overvalued dollar, manufacturing declining, imports surging, balance of trade destroyed, the need for more borrowing, therefore having to pay higher interest rates, and around we go again. No attempt has been made to resolve any of those basic problems. So is it all doom and gloom? I've had nearly 50 years now, I'm sorry to say, in public life of one kind or another. And I've learned one or two things. They're not always the things you'd like to know, but they are this. There are never final battles in politics. However conclusive your win may be, it can be reversed. But if you lose, you can reverse that too. What matters is fighting the battle. If you don't fight the battle, and you vacate the battlefield and leave it to your opponents, you've let yourselves and everybody else down. I think this is the moment to renew that battle. Not just here in domestic politics, although that's certainly true, but right across the board. I think Reinhart and Rogoff have been very significant. I think that is the turning point. I think the last supposedly intellectual underpinnings of neoliberalism are being stripped away. And every day that goes by, the trials and tribulations of millions being put unnecessarily, needlessly out of work. Many more forced into poverty. Whole countries destroyed for a generation. We can't ignore those lessons any longer. Now is the time to make our case. And our case is that the values of dog eat dog, devil take the hindmost, look after number one, grab what you can and don't care about anything else, those are not our values. And when I say our, I don't just mean the PSA or our position in politics, I mean New Zealand values. Our values remain, and if you scratch the surface for a moment, you'll discover this is true. Our values remain those that defined this country. Tolerance, compassion, sympathy, community, fairness. These are the things that we cleave to. And we have the opportunity of showing that those values give us a better guide to our future than anything that's come from the neoliberal agenda. We can pursue those values without having to make the choice that we're so often told we have to make. John Key and his minions will tell you that everything they do is justified because that's the only way to get economic efficiency. You don't have to choose. Believe me, you don't have to choose between social justice and economic efficiency. There's nothing economically efficient about keeping large numbers of our fellow citizens idle and out of work and unable to support themselves. There's nothing economically efficient about cutting essential public services. There's nothing economically efficient about allowing inequality to widen so that we have 2 or 3 different viewpoints of the economy contesting with each other instead of a common purpose. There's nothing economically efficient about allowing all the decisions and all the economic power to be corralled into a few hands, people who then don't see the world as most people do, see only a self-interested viewpoint in which they can go on grabbing what they can. That's not economically efficient. If we want an inclusive society, we also need an inclusive economy where everybody is entitled to make their contribution. And that's what we've got to go on fighting for. You're just completing your first 100 years. It's been a very honourable record. The next 100 years is just beginning. The battles are still there to be fought. I've got no doubt that you're up to the challenge. Thank you very much.
What a fantastic opening to your 2 days. And we'll take some of this, the comments that Bryan has made through these 2 days, because fighting the battle is what matters. And I think as you progress through the day, you'll see that the program ends up talking specifically about that battle. I had an interesting comment from Brenda. I was just chatting to her about a political party that I happen to be in, and banging my head against the wall in frustration at this and that. And she just said, "Get over it." And that's not a bad thing to take through the day. You think about the blockages, come on, let's get over it. And that was fantastic talk. Thanks very much, Bryan. Questions? Now, what I thought we'd do with questions is we would a person pop up their hand. If somebody can't hear them down that end, I'll go to the mic. But let's just try asking questions and see if people can be heard. Question?
Bryan, you talk about the economy as if it was a noun, but it's just a model. You haven't talked to us about what the other models are, and it seems to me that it appears as if you're looking at the current model, that it can remain in place and be improved. But actually I would say the current model is inherently flawed and demented mathematically. So I'd like you to talk about the other models.
Well, the first thing I'd do is just defend mildly my use of the term economy. The economy is whatever the economic process is. There are, like rightly, as you say, all sorts of different kinds of economy, and probably the sort of what we talk about when we mention the word economy is something that probably hasn't existed for more than about 200 years, you know, a modern economy. And it's an economy for which governments and one, you know, or whatever is running a particular society, that they will have quite a large impact on. There will be all sorts of influences on a developing economy. Economies develop all the time. They are robust things. If this economy wasn't robust, we'd be even flatter on our backs than we are now. Because whatever mistakes governments make, and governments of all persuasions go on making, there's no question on that, whatever mistakes happen, there is still an economy. People are still able to produce and exchange goods and so on, under whatever regime is applying. So a modern economic policy, and I think you would be deluding yourself if you thought we don't need an economic policy, particularly if we're purporting to, if we want to be in government. I'm not talking about one particular party, but if we want to bring about change, and I still believe that government provides the major levers of power. If we want to do that, we have to have some idea of what we're going to do about the economy. It may need to take account of peak oil or the impact on the environment. I think it does. I think it needs to be integrated with a whole range of social concerns about discrimination and how people are treated in the workforce, all sorts of things like that. But they're still about the economy. And I think there's sometimes a tendency to say, oh, that's all too difficult and we've never been able to make it work. So let's opt out of all this and let's somehow, in some really rather ill-defined way, let's do without an economy or economic policy. In fact, I've just written a piece, and my position isn't anything of great interest to you, but I keep a weather eye on British politics as well as on New Zealand politics. And I've just written, for the first time, quite a lengthy piece, which I think is going to be published at the end of this week, because in Britain, some of the leftish websites are starting to talk about the end of the neoliberal era. And I think that's right. And they're very strong on all sorts of social and environmental policies, all good stuff. What strikes me is they're not prepared to take on the neoliberals on these central issues of running the economy. I don't know of anybody, certainly not in politics at any rate, I think someone like a Paul Krugman could fall into this category, but I know very few others who can give a blueprint to an incoming left-of-centre government as to how they could produce a better, fairer, more efficient, more sustainable economy. And I've tried to do that in about 5,000 words, not easy. And I don't think we can duck that challenge. However tempting it is to say, oh, we'll abandon all that. We'll have some other kind of arrangement. You need to specify what it is, who's going to make the decisions, what framework are people going to operate in. And the problem with the current government is that they're quite close to your position in the sense, I'm not presuming I know your position. They too say, really it's got nothing much to do with the government. The present government says, get the government out of the way. Ronald Reagan said, the government isn't the solution, the government is the problem. It's crazy stuff. We need, if the government is going to get out of the way, who prevails? The powerful. That's what they want. A free market. Yes. We can exploit that free market, we can drive our advantage home, we can impoverish people to the point where they can't really pay for the stuff we offer them, and then we'll let the pressure off of it. If you want to do better than that, you've got to have an economic policy.
Just thank one. Just very quickly, I have had an instruction from Kerry by paper and also by semaphore. Been looking over that way. Kerry would like us to work in groups, just very quickly, and to come up with some questions in your groups. Okay, we'll come back to that, and we'll give you 3 minutes on that. I'm just looking at Kerry to see if that's correct.
Realistically, I need those people were not available to take that job, then someone would have to pay at least minimum wage to actually do that. So those people are actually contributing not just socially, but actually economically.
Table B, a question.
Itself. You go right back to the Luddites. When machines were first introduced, they destroyed them because they feared that the machines would take their jobs. To a certain point, they were right. The modern technological revolution is in course of doing this to a much greater degree than I think is currently recognized. The problem is, we run an economy, and this really goes back to your broad question earlier, we run an economy where it's absolutely taken for granted, no one ever questions it, that capital has all the rights. It's capital that buys the new technology and machinery. It's capital that decides whether to employ labour or not. It's capital that takes all the returns and then reinvests it. We are facing a situation where the claim of labour on the proceeds of the economic process is being eroded all the time. It's not an accident that in the aftermath of the global financial crisis we've seen unemployment rising across the board, and what is said to be a substantial number of people who just can't get jobs because it is claimed they're unemployable, they don't have the skills. The answer to that is to make sure that they do get the skills. And most people are able to function perfectly well in the modern economy. John Maynard Keynes, back in the 1930s, predicted that it wouldn't be long before modern technology meant that we could produce everything we conceivably wanted by working, on average, about 15 hours a week. He's right. We could, or something like that. What he didn't foresee was that the results of that process wouldn't be fairly shared. That's what's made the difference. If we want, I think, to live with that modern technology and the benefits that it can bring us, and I think it can. I mean, I don't think we should turn our backs on it. But we have to find other ways of sharing work and other bases on which people can exercise their rights and other bases on which people can make their claims on our economy. Because the sad truth is, unless we wake up and realize it, this is, I think, what's at the base of your question, labour as the basis on which to claim a share of the nation's wealth is losing its power. The more that technology improves and develops, the more those who own the technology, and that means an increasingly smaller group of people, because only they have the capital, the more they will dominate the economic process. And then the rest of us are left to be social security claimants, beneficiaries, at the whim and mercy of those who control the economic process. We have, I mean, this morning isn't necessarily exactly the moment to consider these very deep issues, but we need to be aware of these things, and therefore I very much welcome your question. Let's go for the technology, but we have to think about what the implications are.
Table H, do you have a question? Table H.
I've got more of a comment than a question. It just reflects to me. And I would suggest that maybe one of the problems is that none of the main political parties in New Zealand at the moment, or all the main political parties in New Zealand at the moment, are reflective and captured on the neoliberal paradigm, and they work in their discussions and happens within that paradigm. And that's one of the problems that we have actually. I'm not saying that the answers, but I'm saying that's the issue. We have discussions, all seems to be about tinkering around the edges rather than actually talking about real change.
Did you guys hear that down here?
Yeah.
All of the main political parties are captured by that neoliberal agenda.
I absolutely agree with that. And it's still happening today, that's the point I was making. The only... once you accept that a market economy means that the market can't be challenged, you can kiss goodbye to everything else. And you kiss goodbye to democracy. The whole point of democracy is that it harnesses the political power of the majority to be able to stand up to what's otherwise the overwhelming economic power of a small minority. But if the small minority are able to persuade us that the market must always have its way, we're lost. Then we're reduced, as you rightly say, to fiddling around the edges. And I'm afraid that so thorough has been the dominance of neoliberalism over the past 30 years that even parties of the supposed left, and I'm no revolutionary, don't right, you know, I'm very moderate Keynesian basically, but even the supposed left dares not challenge the neoliberal agenda. They dare not be accused of being anti-business, because we're now so brainwashed that the only thing that really matters is the bottom line. The market mustn't be challenged. That making money is all that is really worth doing. And if a party, whether it's Labour, the Greens, doesn't matter who, get up and say, we're going to change that, then a John Key, as we've already heard, will start talking about the far left and it'll be Cossack soldiers or dancers all over again. But there are signs of change. I think, just a couple of comments about the New Zealand scene. And by comparison with other countries, this is quite significant. The Greens, I think, with a leadership that is now prepared to engage on some of these issues, they're doing much better. They've got more of a cutting edge to their policies. At one point they just said, we must be careful of the environment. Now they understand that you can't be careful of the environment if the market is allowed to run free. You have to regulate the market. The Labour Party, David Parker, David Cunliffe, they are beginning to look again at the treadmill that I was describing earlier. They're beginning to say, we will change that. It's going to be hard. That's why I was talking earlier about writing a comprehensive economic policy. You can't just trundle out one aspect of that policy and hope that it's going to hold together, because it just looks so odd in terms of the context in which the economic policy debate is being held. You have to change that context. You have to say this is a completely different approach. It's still mainstream economics. It's still pretty much straight Keynesianism, but we've grown so far away from these reasonable and sensible policies that even to advance them at all is to run a political risk, an electoral risk. That's the difficulty. But I'm not without hope on that. But your question is entirely pointing in the right direction. What you're saying is exactly what's been true for the last 30 years.
You've stumbled. Any other questions?
Oh, yes, one here.
We have
Oh,
Joe.
yeah, we were just talking about the sort of...
Stand up, Joe, and speak.
We're just talking about putting it into sort of political action in terms of some of these changes, talking about in terms of rolling back the Liberal side. In terms of a progressive government being elected, hopefully next election, some of the legislation that's sort of underpinning these things, so State Sector Act, Public Finance Act, Reserve Bank Act, we get it tomorrow. What's the first thing you sort of repeal? What's the primary thing that's sort of going to indicate that this sort of neoliberal kind of dominance of the political economy is going to be wiped out?
Did everyone get that? What thing would you first repeal if you were going to start the rollback?
And I think the options, I'm sure it wasn't a complete list, but Public Finance Act, State Sector Act, Reserve Bank. Let me take just one, because it's a big subject to ask, and a very good question. Let's take the Reserve Bank Act. I bet you, if you were asked in this room, do you support the idea of an independent central bank being responsible for the policy that restrains inflation? I bet there's a majority in this room that would say yes. But stop and think just for a moment. We run an economy where the only purpose of macroeconomic policy, I'm sorry to use these jargon terms, but for running the economy as a whole, the only goal that is set is to restrain inflation. Are we bothered by inflation at the moment? Not our big problem, is it really? But that's all we've got. And we're then told that controlling inflation is actually a pretty simple task. Indeed it is, if we were running a more sensible overall policy. But because we're very uncompetitive as an economy, by that I mean we're trying to charge far too much, with very few exceptions. We get away with dairy, nothing much else. Because we're uncompetitive, as soon as we try and grow, we run into inflationary problems. So we say controlling inflation is a terrifically important matter. And incidentally, that policy, which is called monetarism, makes it impossible for us ever to achieve full employment again. As soon as there's the slightest hint of inflation building in the economy, the brakes will go on and unemployment will remain high. It suits the employers very well. But it's not necessary. In fact, it's completely wrong, and it denies one of the great strengths of the market economy. I'm sorry, I'm taking on a lot of other issues before I get to yours. One of the great strengths of the market economy, and all these people who proclaim proudly that they support the free market don't seem to have the slightest faith in the possibility of a market economy growing. If you provide the funding for investment and productive purposes, your economy will grow. Our problem is we provide funding for house prices. But we say that controlling inflation is the only thing that matters, that it's an essentially technical task which involves controlling the money supply, and that can safely be, indeed best be, entrusted to an unaccountable banker. And he takes the flak for anything that goes wrong. Politicians in Parliament elected to run our country, run our economy, they say it's nothing to do with us. You happy with that? Are bankers objective? Do they look to the needs of the whole economy? Or are they self-interested? Look around the globe. Will bankers back up other bankers, do you think? Are they really concerned about the unemployed? What are we doing? Handing over what remains of economic policy to bankers, for heaven's sake. Yes, I would repeal the Reserve Bank Act, or at least I'd make some very real changes to it. I mean, there are all sorts of possibilities as first steps. I personally would go the whole hog. But you would immediately say, as the Americans have said, inflation's not the only thing that matters, half the time it doesn't matter. It's not the problem. Look at full employment, look at the full use of resources, look at competitiveness. Lots of other things much more important. So if you did want to retain some role for the central bank, that's what you'd ask them to look at. And you'd give them a lot more instruments of policy than simply raising interest rates. Now, again, going back to the point that you were raising, there are just a couple of little hints of a change here. The new governor of the Reserve Bank, Graham Wheeler, started off as though he's the most orthodox person you could imagine. I suspect he still is. But he's beginning to understand that yes, if there is an inflationary problem, it's not the one that he thinks it is. The inflationary problem is the freedom of the banks to go on lending as much as they possibly can, to stimulate the whole business of lending, to apply a great bellows under the flame that is the Auckland housing market. That's the interest of the banks. It's the easiest possible lending, it's on good security, and it makes them a lot of money. And we preside over that, saying this is all a matter for the banks. The governor of the Reserve Bank, he'll deal with this. He's just beginning to see that just fiddling with interest rates does a lot of damage by pushing up the value of the dollar. Whereas there are much more obvious things that can be done, one of which is to restrain bank lending, to make sure it goes for proper purposes. I'm not saying that's technically an easy thing to do, but that's what we should be doing. But we should be bringing macroeconomic policy back into Parliament so that Prime Ministers and Ministers of Finance and anybody claiming to play a role in these matters, they should be answerable. There is no more important question in democratic politics than how is the economy run and in whose interests is it run. But we have a system at the moment which says that's a purely technical question. Why are you getting steamed up about that? We can hand that over to good old Graham Wheeler or Don Brash. I mean, we know Don Brash was absolutely objective, don't we? He wasn't politically informed or motivated, was he? And yet we ran this country's economy for whatever it was, 11 or 12 years, with Don Brash being the only person able to make any decisions. We're happy with that? So yes, we do need to start making some decisions, and I would certainly do so.